In Book 2 of the Republic, Glaucon argues that justice is merely instrumentally valuable, valuable for its consequences only. He gives a three-part argument for this claim. The first bit has to do with the nature and origin of social justice. The next bit has to do with human nature. Here, Glaucon claims that people act justly, not willingly or because they think that justice is any good to them individually, but rather because it has good social consequences. And really, he goes on to argue, it's not being just that has good social consequences, it's appearing just that has good social consequences. So it's important to note that Glaucon's claim here is about how people are, how they will act, what they do think. And so this is something that we can ask from the perspective of contemporary psychology. This is a question about how human beings are, not necessarily how they should be, but how they are. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to summarize a paper by psychologist Daniel Batson called Moral Masquerades: Experimental Exploration of the Nature of Moral Motivation. And this paper includes a series of experimental studies that try to answer the question of what drives people's actions. So why do people act morally? Option number one, the desire to uphold moral principles, like fairness. Call this moral integrity. The person who's motivated by moral integrity does the fair thing because it's the fair thing. Or is it option two, the desire to appear moral, but also whenever possible, avoid the costs of actually being moral? Call this moral hypocrisy. So what do you think? Do people do the moral thing when they do it from moral integrity or moral hypocrisy? Do people care about being just or just appearing just? So how are we going to test this? Well, first, we'll pick a widely endorsed moral principle, the principle of fairness, and we'll set up a scenario that elicits that behavior in a range of contexts to try to narrow in on the motivations. So here's the basic setup. Imagine that you're a participant in a study. You come in and they tell you, actually, there's two tasks, and you can decide which one you get assigned to, and then the other one will get assigned to somebody else. Task number one, you get a $30 raffle or a raffle ticket for a $30 prize for every correct response you give. Task number two, no reward for correct responses. Also, this task is kind of dull and boring. So again, you get to choose which one you get assigned to, and then someone will also be assigned to the other one. Do you want to assign yourself to the positive task? Or do you want to assign the other person to the positive task and take the boring one for yourself? Probably you said, I'll take that positive task. Next question. On a scale from 1 to 9, 1 being no, 9 being yes, do you think the way you made the task assignment, giving it to yourself instead of someone else, was that morally right? Go ahead and give yourself a score. Imagine you just did this. Here's what people did. 80% assigned themselves to the good task. 5% said that this process actually was the most moral. Giving it to yourself was the most moral. So people are giving it to themselves even though they don't actually think it's the most moral. And then of those who gave themselves the good task, on a scale of 1 to 9, rated their action as a 4.38 on average on how moral it was. So, not very high, at about the midpoint. And those who gave it to the other rated it quite high. That doesn't tell us anything about moral hypocrisy. That's just step one. Now we need to start introducing some variations. So version 2, this time, same two tasks. Again, you get to decide which one you're assigned to, which someone else is assigned to, But this time, the piece of paper that you choose your task on comes with a little bag with a quarter in it. So now you have another way to decide which task you get assigned to. You could flip a coin, or you could just assign yourself to whichever one you want, or give the other one the stranger the good task. So, question, in order to be fair, should you flip the coin? Most people judge that flipping the coin is the fairest way, the most moral way in this scenario to make this decision. So what do people do? Okay, so some people flipped the coin and some people didn't. Let's look at the people who did not flip the coin first. Of the people who didn't flip at all, 90% gave themselves the positive task, 10% gave it to the other. Now, of all these people, only 10% said giving yourself the task was the most moral thing to do. So people are giving it to themselves even though they judge it's not the most moral thing to do. And then again, when asked to rate how moral their way of choosing was, they gave it an average of like 3.56, so not very high. Now let's compare with the people who chose to flip the coin. Again, 90% assigned themselves to the positive consequences good task. 0% judged that giving themselves the good task was the most moral. And now they have rated how moral their decision process was at a 7. So this is potentially striking. How many people would you expect to be assigned to the good task on the basis of a fair coin flip? 50, right? Thereabouts. So clearly some people are flipping the coin, not flipping it in their favor or somehow, and still assigning themselves the good task. But what happens is their own perception of how they chose this task, how moral it was, has suddenly gone up. 7 seems pretty good. So what's going on here? It seems like people are deceiving themselves in some way, thinking that what they did is more moral than it was, when it was essentially fiddling with a coin and then assigning yourself the task, right? What could happen? Do you have a hypothesis about how people flipped the coin and then ended up in the good task? Well, one option is that maybe people didn't really decide like which was heads and which was tails. Like I flipped it and you're like, heads, oh, that's good, good for me. Or you flip it and you go, tails, and like, oh, that's bad for the other person. So the next study labels the coin. This time, instead of just being a quarter, one side says self to positive task, and the other side says the opposite. Okay, so it's not at all ambiguous what a flip means. Of the people who didn't flip the coin, we have some data again, it's about the same. Let's look at the people who did flip the coin, the labeled coin. 86% of people who flipped this labeled coin ended up assigning themselves to the good task, and again, feeling pretty good about it. So one thing you might be wondering is, well, some percentage of this group flipped the coin and did assign, like flip it in their favor, and then rated themselves really high, and maybe the other people did something else and then gave themselves a lower, and maybe it averages out to maybe more like 6 is accurate, but still that would be an increase. But we can ask this, can we get better data? So the next study, they colored the labels and then peeked in at the people making the decision, and they could see what actually had been flipped, and we can tell now who actually got what flip and got a true I get the good task flip, and who fiddled with the coin or made stuff up. Okay, so again, we have a bunch of people who didn't flip the coin, just signed themselves, 25% just gave it to the other people. Now we have 32 people who flipped the coin, and of those, 86% assigned themselves to the good task, and with an average of 6.3, rating how moral their decision-making process was. Now, of the flipping the coin group, 11 people actually got a flip in their favor, positive to self, it said on the coin, and then they assigned themselves to the good task accordingly. And on average, they rated their way of making this decision a 7.45. And then we've got 16 people who call it fiddled. Some of them flipped other to or positive to other, like other people get the good task. Some of them kept flipping until it came up positive to self, and some people just said they flipped but didn't really flip. And of the people who were in this fiddled with the coin category but didn't actually flip the thing that gives them the good task, they rated the morality of the way they assign the tasks at a 5.56. So compared with the people who didn't flip a coin at all, gave themselves the good task, and then rated it, that's a 3.89 for how moral that process was, people rating it. And the people who like fiddled with a coin first and then gave themselves the good task, we still have a much higher assessment of how moral the thing you just did was. Okay, so what does that mean? It rules out a certain kind of self-deception, that we're just deceiving ourselves about what we actually did. So maybe our next choice, the next study, we can try to rule out whether or not we're actually applying the principle to our actions. So there's a series of studies that suggest that having a mirror, seeing, or in any way being brought closer to self-awareness, self-reflection, brings the distance between your principles and your actions closer together. So that's a general finding we already have. So in the final experimental setup, they put a mirror in the room. And in this case, when people flipped the coin, only 50% assigned themselves to the positive task, which is what we'd expect. And then we've got higher ratings of how moral we are. So what conclusion do we draw from this? What do you think? Does this back up, provide a kind of contemporary experimental support for Glaucon's view about how human beings are and about the value of merely appearing just, if only to yourself, versus actually being just?